I was the child left behind. For 40 years, I called that survival. Today, watching the black ships return to our orbit, I understand it was something else entirely. What do you call a man who was never wanted enough to be taken? I have been asking myself that question since dawn. I asked it while I dressed, pulling on the same gray maintenance coverall I have worn for 23 years, the fabric worn smooth at the knees and elbows where I kneel and reach into conduit housings. I asked it while I walked the deep corridors of hive ethers, past the moisture weeping from junction seals, past the smell of recycled air and rationed steam that has been the atmosphere of my entire life. I asked it standing at the observation port on sublevel 9, where the glass is thick enough to distort the stars into smears of white light, and where, if you press your forehead to the cold surface and look up at the right angle, you can see the upper atmosphere. And there they were, the black ships, 3 of them vast and dark and unhurried, the way death is always unhurried when it is not coming for you specifically. The ships move through the upper atmosphere like something from a dream I cannot quite place. I have seen them before. I was 5 years old, and they were the most important thing in the world. And then I was 6, and they were gone. And my sister was gone with them. And the world reconfigured itself around her absence the way living tissue reconfigures around a wound. I have not thought about the ships in years. I have not thought about my sister in years. I have been very careful about what I allow myself to think about. Careful is the word my supervisor used once, approvingly, when she reviewed my maintenance logs. Kallin is careful. She told someone in the corridor, very precise. You can trust his assessments. I noted that down in my journal that evening, between the temperature reading from junction 77 alpha and the humidity variance in the lower residential corridor. I noted it down because I did not know what else to do with it. I am 47 years old. I have been keeping journals since I was 12. There are 61 of them stacked in a plastic crate beneath my bunk, and if you were to read them in sequence, you would learn something important about what I have become. You would learn it slowly, the way I lived it. In the early volumes, the pages are filled with the outside world. Temperatures, pressures, the cataloged sounds of the hive at different hours, the precise color of the light in the upper corridors at shift change, when the lumiglobes dimmed to simulate evening. I was an observant child, and I wrote down everything I saw, because I believed that if I recorded the world with sufficient accuracy, I would eventually understand it. Later volumes are thinner. The observations become more internal, the data points more personal. In volume 43, which covers my 38th year, there is an entry that reads, resting pulse this morning was 61 beats per minute. No deviation from baseline. Father's funeral was yesterday. I note no deviation from baseline. I am uncertain whether this is acceptable. I do not know what the baseline should be. In volume 44, there are 11 blank pages in a row. I remember the period they represent. I was not busy. I simply had nothing to record. There was nothing happening inside me, and I had long since grown bored of the temperature in junction 77 alpha. But the ships are back, and the census is beginning. And somewhere in my chest, in the region where I understand from anatomical reference that emotion is processed and stored, there is something I cannot measure. It is not precisely a feeling. It is more like the space where a feeling used to be, still shaped like that feeling, the walls of the cavity, still holding the impression. I do not have a clinical notation for it. I have been standing at this observation port for 40 minutes. And I cannot decide whether what I am experiencing is grief or simply the recognition of its absence. And I am not sure anymore that those are different things. I was 5 years old when my sister was celebrated. I need to be precise about this. I was 5 years and 4 months old. It was the 2nd month of the census season, and my sister Mafra was 9. I know these facts with certainty because I recorded them in the very first volume of my journals. In handwriting that belongs to a person I recognize only distantly, the letters rounded and uncertain, the ink pressed hard into the page the way children press hard when they are concentrating. Entry 1. My sister was chosen today. There was a celebration. I will try to describe it accurately. I managed 4 sentences before I ran out of words, and then I drew a picture of the candles. The candles were white and tall, and there were 12 of them, arranged in a circle on the table in our HAB unit's main room. And they cast a light that made everyone's face look softer than usual. And they cast a light that made everyone's face look softer than usual. More like a recording of a face than an actual face. My mother had borrowed a good tablecloth from the neighbor Tessara, the one who had lost her own son to the ships 6 years prior, and kept the tablecloth folded in tissue because she said it was appropriate only for holy occasions. And this, she said, pressing it into my mother's hands, this is a holy occasion. My mother had cooked a real meal, not a ration. She had traded a month's extra coupons for a piece of actual meat, and I can still access the smell of it if I hold very still and do not think about anything else. The fat rendering. In the pan, the smell of something living being transformed into something nourishing. The way the whole HAB unit felt different that night. Warmer, louder, more permeable to the world outside its walls. I did not understand at 5 years old what the celebration meant. I understood that my sister had been chosen, that men in gray robes had come to our unit that morning and spent a long time looking at Mavra, and then spent a shorter time speaking to my father in a language I did not recognize. And then one of them had put a hand briefly on Mavra's shoulder, and the hand was very white against her dark coverall. And then they left, and my mother began to cry. I understood that crying in our household was a complicated thing. My mother cried at the funeral of her own mother, and she cried when the ration dispensers were empty for 3 days. And she cried now, and these were the same tears, and they were different tears. And I was 5 years old, and I could not parse the distinction. What I understood was the candles and the meat and the neighbors filing in, bringing small gifts, a bolt of cloth, a sealed container of real spice, a hand-painted card that said, in letters I could read because Mavra had taught me, in the Emperor's grace, your daughter serves. I understood that these things meant Mavra was important, more important than I had known. Mavra herself sat in the center of the celebration, the way a stone sits in the center of a pond, everything radiating outward from her and nothing quite reaching her. She was 9, and she was very still, and when the neighbors spoke to her, she answered correctly, yes, honored yes, grateful yes, the Emperor's will, and her hands were folded in her lap and her eyes were steady. I watched her from my position at the edge of the room, where I had been assigned a small chair and a plate with a portion of the real meat on it, and I ate the meat very slowly because I understood somehow that it needed to be remembered, and I watched my sister be still in the center of the light, and I thought, she is being taken somewhere important, and she is not afraid. I was afraid. I was afraid in the way that 5-year-olds are afraid of things they cannot name. The fear that lives in the stomach and makes eating difficult. The fear that comes from understanding that the shape of the world is changing and you are not certain where you will fit in the new shape. I ate my meat and I watched my sister and I smiled when I was told to smile. When my father lifted me onto his shoulders so I could see above the press of neighbors and said, Kallin, smile. This is a good night. Smile. This is a good night. And I smiled. I was good at being told what to do. I have always been good at that. The celebration lasted until the 3rd hour of the night cycle. People left one by one, embracing my mother, gripping my father's arm, speaking to Mavra with a reverence I had previously seen, reserved for the Aquila printed above the high priest's altar. And then the last neighbor was gone, and the candles were guttering low, and my father blew out the last of them himself, slowly, one by one around the circle, and the room went dark in stages, each extinguished candle removing a portion of warmth from the air until we were standing in the corridor light that leaked under the HAB unit door, and my father said, sleep now, and we slept. I woke in the deep of the night to the smell of extinguished candles, the particular smell of hot wax cooling, of smoke becoming a memory of smoke. The bunk above mine was empty. I lay looking up at it for a long time. Mavra had slept in the bunk above mine since I could remember, and the underside of her mattress had a depression in its center, where her weight had settled over years, a body-shaped impression in the foam. And sometimes at night I would look up at it and find it comforting, the way you find comforting things that are present even when the thing itself is absent. I lay looking at it, and I could smell the extinguished candles, and I could hear my parents in the other room, not speaking, just the sound of their breathing. And I understood that something had been subtracted from my world, not removed violently. Subtracted, the way a calculation is reduced. Mavra was gone. The number had changed. Everything that followed would be from the new, smaller number. I did not cry. I recall this with some precision. I lay in my bunk and I looked at the impression in the mattress above me, and I waited for something to happen inside me, some feeling that would tell me what this event meant. And what came instead was the smell of extinguished candles, and eventually I slept again. In the morning, my mother made rations from the standard dispenser, and we ate in silence, and I did not ask where Mavra was because I understood that the question would be painful. And I was, even at 5 years old, reluctant to cause pain. I recorded the event in my journal instead. My sister was chosen today. There was a celebration. I will try to describe it accurately. And then I ran out of words and I drew the candles. I think about that drawing sometimes. The candles are imprecise, the proportions wrong, the flames rendered as simple teardrops because I did not yet have the skill to draw fire, but they are arranged in a circle correctly. I got that part right. I always got the arrangement right. The structure, the pattern, the careful positioning of observable objects. I was very good at that. I am still very good at that. The 40 years between that drawing and this observation port are a question I have spent most of my life refusing to examine directly. I am going to examine them. Now, the ships are in orbit. The census officers will reach this sublevel in 2 days, perhaps 3. I have time to be thorough, and I have always believed that thoroughness is its own form of integrity, that the careful recording of accurate data is a service to the truth, regardless of whether anyone will read the record. I am going to examine the 40 years the way I examine a failing conduit, systematically, starting at the point of origin, tracing the damage forward through time, identifying where the degradation became structural. I was ordinary. This is the first and most important fact. I was ordinary in a way that became apparent to everyone quickly, the way certain things become apparent upon inspection, not dramatically, but undeniably. My sister had been something else. I had not fully understood this until she was gone, because when she was present she was simply my sister, the person who taught me to read and who sometimes, in the nights when the hive's ventilation system produced a particular low moan, reached down from her upper bunk and let her hand hang in the air between our bunks, not touching me, just present, just there, so I would know the moan was only air and not something that needed to be feared. When she was gone, the teachers at the Skolum began to understand what she had been, and by contrast, what I was. Not unkindly. They were not unkind people. But there is a way a teacher looks at a child who is not exceptional, a particular quality of attention that is less than full attention, a careful, measured investment of effort commensurate with expected return. And I learned to recognize it very early. And I found it not painful. Precisely, but informative. I was informative. I was instructive. I was a data point from which other people occasionally drew conclusions about the distribution of gifts in a given family. I heard this said once, directly, at the E of 11, when a neighbor was visiting my mother and I was in the adjacent corridor, nominally performing a household errand but actually listening through the ventilation grate, a habit I had developed because I found that people said more accurate things when they did not know they were observed. The neighbor said, "It is a shame, isn't it, about the boy?" And my mother said, "He is a good boy, he is careful and steady." And the neighbor said, of course, you know what I mean though." And my mother said nothing. And I noted this exchange in my journal that evening with clinical precision, including the 3-second pause before my mother's second response and the quality of the silence after the neighbor's final statement. I noted it and I moved on. I was 11 years old, and I had already learned that the appropriate response to an uncomfortable truth was its precise documentation. This is what the 40 years look like from the outside, a competent man living a small life. I completed my scholam with marks that were consistently adequate. I applied for maintenance apprenticeship and was accepted on my second attempt, the first attempt having been in a period when the available positions were limited and the selection criteria favored candidates with higher aptitude scores. I served my apprenticeship under a man named Vorik, who was patient and thorough, and who taught me everything he knew about the deep systems of the hive without ever suggesting that I was anything other than a reliable pair of hands. I received my maintenance certification at the age of 22. I have held the same position in the same sublevel ever since. I know these corridors the way you know things that have become part of the background of your existence, not as a collection of observed facts, but as an extension of your body, the particular slope of the floor in Junction 9. Here the settling of the hive over centuries has created a permanent lean, the sound the ventilation makes at different pressures, the smell of a conduit that is beginning to fail versus one that has already failed. I am very good at my work. I want to note this. It seems important that it be noted because I am about to say many things that are not flattering about the man I have become, and I do not want the record to suggest that I wasted the years. The conduits of sublevel 9 function. The moisture seals hold. The environmental systems that keep this particular slice of the hive habitable operate within acceptable variance, because I maintain them with a precision that my supervisors have consistently praised. I want that on the record. I was useful. I did my function. The Imperium's machinery, at its smallest and most local scale, benefited from my presence. But I am standing at an observation port watching the black ships in orbit, and I am 47 years old, and I am trying to remember the last time I felt something that was not a noted absence of feeling, and I cannot locate it with any precision. I can locate its approximate region, somewhere around my 32nd year. I noted in volume 31, unexpected response to a sound in the upper corridors today, a child's laughter, 3 floors above, heard through the ventilation. Elevated pulse for approximately 8 seconds, 11 beats per minute above baseline. Source of elevation unclear. I analyzed the entry afterward. I think the laughter sounded like Mavra's. I think that for 8 seconds and 11 beats per minute above baseline, I missed my sister. I think that may have been the last time. After that, the entries grow thinner, and the gaps grow longer, and the spaces between words grow wider, as though the journal itself is expanding to accommodate the growing emptiness of its subject. Let me be precise about the autopsy I am performing. An autopsy begins with external observation and proceeds inward. External observation. I am a functional adult male of 47 years, employed, housed, fed, unremarkable in every measurable category. Proceed inward. Cardiovascular, functional. Respiratory, functional. Neurological, functional. Psychological. Here the instrument hesitates. Here the clinical notation becomes uncertain. What is the correct terminology for a man who has spent 40 years measuring the world from behind a glass wall of his own construction, who has cataloged every external temperature and pressure and humidity reading while the interior of his own experience became something he could no longer access with any useful instrument? I went to see a hive priest once. I want to record this. I was 39 years old, and it was 3 years after my father's funeral, and I had just finished volume 44. The one with 11 blank pages, and I understood that something was wrong in a way I could not calibrate. The priest was a small man in brown robes who smelled of incense and recycled air, and he sat behind a metal desk in a small room off the primary worship hall on sublevel 6, and I told him what I have been trying to describe here, the sensation-feeling gap, the growing silence inside. The way events I understood should produce response instead produced only careful observation. He was quiet for a while after I finished. Then he said, "The Emperor places each of us where we are needed. The ordinary serve the extraordinary by holding the world steady. There is grace in that," he said. There is purpose in being the foundation. I thanked him. I noted the exchange in my journal that evening. I noted his words precisely. Then I noted my response to his words, which was nothing. Not disagreement, not comfort, nothing. The words fell int, oh me, and kept falling, finding no surface to land on, no cavity of belief or hope or faith in which to settle and become meaningful. I had been told that my ordinariness was a form of service. I had heard this before, in various forms, from various sources. The Skolum administrator who approved my adequate marks, the neighbor who said, of course, you know what I mean. My supervisor who called me careful and precise. They were all telling me the same thing in different registers, and the thing they were all telling me was, you are the background, you are the substrate on which the significant things rest. You are necessary in the way that walls are necessary, unnoticed in the normal operation of any space, but integral to its structural integrity. I want to tell you what it is like to be a wall for 40 years. I want to tell you, because I have not told anyone, because I had no language for it until now, because the ships in orbit have performed some function I do not have a name for. Some extraction of the story I have been keeping carefully folded inside me, and now it is unfolding whether I intend it to or not. It is like this. You wake each morning in a hab unit sized for one person. Because you have been sized for one person by 40 years of careful living, and you dress in your coverall, and you walk your corridors, and you perform your function. And when you pass other people in the corridors, they nod at you, and you nod at them. And sometimes they say something about the environmental systems or the humidity levels or the smell from Junction 7, and you respond with appropriate precision, and they are satisfied and they move on, and at no point in this exchange does any person look at you the way you look at a thing that contains something interesting. You are looked at the way a functioning conduit is looked at, with the absence of concern that is indistinguishable from the outside, from contentment. I found Tessara 3 days ago, the neighbor who lent my mother the tablecloth. She is very old now, 90-something, kept functional by the hive's basic medical provisions, and she lives in the same hab unit she has always lived in, 4 doors down from my childhood home, and her memory is unreliable about many things, but reliable about the things that mattered to her most. I had not spoken to her in years. I knocked on her door in the morning, and she opened it and looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "You're Kallin, the one who wasn't taken," and I said, "Yes, that is what I am." She made me a cup of something hot, and not quite tea, and we sat in her small main room, and I asked her about her son. His name was Perrin. He had been taken 6 years before Mavra, and Tessara had celebrated. She described the celebration with the same kind of precise sensory memory I have. The candles, the neighbors, the special food, the careful faces of people performing the correct emotion. And then I asked her the question I have been carrying since the ships appeared in orbit. I asked her what she did with the years after, how she filled the shape his absence left in her life. She was quiet for a long time. She held her not quite tea in both hands, and she looked at the middle distance, and she said, "I waited." And I said, "For what?" And she said, "I'm not sure. For it to mean something, maybe. For someone to tell me that the waiting was the point, and that the waiting itself was a form of service, or that Perrin had become something extraordinary out there in the Emperor's service, or that the pain of it would eventually translate into something I could use." And I said, "Did it?" And she said nothing. We sat in silence for a while. The ventilation system made its low moan. I noted the approximate frequency. A habit, I cano. T suppress, and then I noted that noting the frequency was itself a symptom of what I was trying to understand, and I let the notation go. Tessara said, "Eventually. The trouble with being the one who stays is that you are very good at staying. The staying becomes the whole of you." And I said, "Yes, I know." And I left, and I walked back to my own corridor, and I stood outside my childhood hab unit, which has been occupied by other people for 30 years now, and I looked at the door. The door is the same. The metal is the same grade. The frame is slightly resettled in the wall. The number plate is a replacement but positioned correctly. I stood looking at it, and I tried to remember the boy who came and went through it. The 5-year-old drawing candles in rounded, imprecise strokes. The 11-year-old listening through the ventilation grate. The young man who moved out at 18 into his own hab unit 3 corridors over and felt, for approximately 2 weeks, something adjacent to relief. Before that, too settled into the baseline. I tried to remember what he wanted, before the wanting became impractical. Before he understood that wanting required a belief in the possibility of receipt, and that he had, somewhere in the long quiet years, lost the belief without noticing the loss. He wanted to be chosen. I need to say this plainly. Not by the ships, not by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. Not necessarily for anything specific. He simply wanted someone to look at him the way the gray-robed men looked at Mavra, with the careful, appraising attention of people who have come a long way specifically to find something, and to find it right here, in this ordinary child standing in an ordinary corridor of an ordinary hive. He wanted the tablecloth brought out for him. He wanted the circle of candles. He wanted to be still at the center of a celebration and feel, even if he was afraid, even if he did not fully understand it, the warmth of being the thing that everyone agrees is worth celebrating. He did not get it. I did not get it. I am standing outside the door of my childhood hab unit, and I am 47 years old, and I have the data to confirm now, at this late hour, that I never got it. What I got was the maintenance apprenticeship and the certification, and the corridors I know, like an extension of my own body. And these things have value. I maintain that they have value. But they are not the same thing, and I have been, for 40 years, pretending that they are the same thing, or more precisely, I have been not pretending. I have been declining to examine the question with sufficient rigor, and the ships in orbit have revoked my permission to decline. The census began 2 days ago. I have been watching it proceed through the sub-level, with the particular attention I give to systems I am already familiar with from past observation. The census officers are efficient and courteous, the way instruments are efficient and courteous, and they work through the hab units methodically, recording, assessing, noting. And then the assessments conclude and one family per corridor, sometimes 2, sometimes none, receives a different kind of visit, and then the celebrations begin. There is a family 4 units down from where I currently live. I have seen their child in the corridor, a girl of perhaps 8, quiet and precise in the way children are when they have been taught to be precise, a quality of stillness about her that I recognized when I first saw it because I have seen it before. I saw it in a 9-year-old sitting at the center of a circle of candles. I saw it in the assessment data the gray-robed men produced after looking at Mavra for a long time. The quality of a thing that has been identified as something, the quality of a thing that is going somewhere. They received their visit yesterday morning. I know because the door stayed closed for 40 minutes, and then the gray-robed men left and the door opened, and the family came into the corridor, and the mother's eyes were bright in a way that could be grief, or could be pride, and is probably both, and is probably neither, is probably something for which we do not have a clean word. And the father went immediately to tell Tessara, who wept and pressed his hands and said, "In the Emperor's grace, your daughter serves." The same words. 40 years later, the same words from the same tablecloth owner who said them to my mother, the ritual repeating itself precisely, the script unchanged by time or grief or any amount of accumulated data. I watched the celebration from my own doorway. I want to be honest about this. I did not intend to watch. I stepped into the corridor to check the moisture seal on the junction housing 20 meters away. The seal I had checked 2 days prior and had no reason to check again, and I stayed because I could not make myself leave. The neighbors filed into the family's hab unit with their small gifts. The smell of something cooking reached the corridor. A child's voice, inside, asked a question in a tone that suggested not fear exactly, but the awareness of standing at the edge of something very large. The door was open and warm light came through it, and I stood in the cooler corridor and watched. My chest had done something in the region where I understand emotion to be processed, not a feeling, Precisely. The imprint of a feeling. The shape of the cavity left by a feeling that was never adequately felt at the time and has since fossilized into something harder and more permanent. I held very still, the way I held still as a 5-year-old watching my sister be celebrated, and I waited to understand what I was feeling, and what I understood was this: I was not grieving, I was recognizing. I was recognizing the ritual the way you recognize a structural feature of the hive, something so fundamental to the architecture that you have walked past it 1,000 times without registering it as a choice. Someone chose to build this thing this way, and someone chose not to build me this way. And the choice was made without my input and finalized before I understood there was a choice being made. And the 40 years since have been the consequence of a decision reached in approximately 1 hour by men in gray robes with instruments I cannot name. I walked away from the celebration. I want to note that I walked away without being asked to leave, without anyone noticing that I had been there, without any interaction or acknowledging or exchange. I was, in my watching of this celebration, as in my watching of the last 147 years ago, simply present on the periphery. The audience, the witness, the one who was not being celebrated, therefore the one who was not quite real in the context of the celebration, who was background, wall, substrate. I walked away, and the door closed behind me. As I rounded the corner and the celebration continued without registering my departure. I walked to the observation port on sublevel 9. I pressed my forehead to the cold glass. The ships were still there, enormous and patient, and dark, fulfilling their function with the same steady competence with which I fulfill mine. I thought about Mafra. I have thought about her more in the last 4 days than in the last 4 years combined, which is itself a kind of data, a symptom of something that has been dislodged by the ship's return. I do not know what happened to her. I have never known, and I have never sought to know, understanding from a young age that this was information I was not entitled to request, and that the seeking of it would cause pain without providing resolution. She was 9 years old, and the gray-robed men put a hand on her shoulder, and she was still at the center of the circle of candles, and she was taken somewhere far from the hive, and she either became something extraordinary in the Emperor's service or she died, and those are possibly the same thing, and in either case she has been gone for 42 years, and the impression in the mattress foam has long since recovered its neutral shape. But I am thinking about her now with a specificity I have not allowed myself before. I am thinking about what it meant that she was taken and I was not. I have spent 40 years understanding this as Mavra was special. I was not. She was needed. I was not. She was taken. I was spared. The narrative I constructed from these facts was one of survival, of luck, of the mercy of ordinariness. I was spared the ships. I was spared whatever it is that happens to the ones the ships carry away. I was ordinary, and ordinary was safe, and safe was good, and the candles were for her and not for me, and this was, if you examined it correctly, a gift. I am examining it correctly for the first time at this observation port, at 47 years old with the black ships overhead, and what I see when I examine it correctly is that I was not spared. Nothing so deliberate as sparing was done on my behalf. The gray-robed men came to our hab unit, and they looked at both children, because presumably they look at all children, and in Mavra, they found what they were looking for, and in me, they found its absence, and they made their notation and moved on. I was not spared. I was not considered. I was insufficient data. I was the negative result of an experiment. The trial that did not produce the expected compound, filed and forgotten. And then I went on living for 42 years inside the conclusion that experiment produced. I have been the walking embodiment of a result that says, nothing of note here, move on. I have been living that result so long that I became it, not found wanting, because wanting implies evaluation, simply not found. The gray-robed men walked through me on their way to my sister, and I have spent 42 years becoming more and more transparent, more and more walkable through. A man shaped by the need to ensure that his absence of significance caused the minimum possible disruption. careful, precise, reliable, quiet, a wall, a conduit, a junction housing, a thing whose function is to hold the structure together so that other things, more significant things, can move through the spaces he maintains. There is a thing I have never written in any of my 61 journals. I have approached it many times, in many different phrasings, in the late hours when the hive noise dims and the ventilation makes its low moan, and the small hab unit holds me in its precise person-sized space. I have approached it, and I have retreated, because recording it seemed like a form of surrendering to it, a confirmation that would make it more real than it already was. I am going to write it now, in this final accounting, because the ships in orbit have already done the confirmation that I feared. There is nothing more to protect. The thing is, I was lonely. I have been lonely for 42 years. Not the dramatic, operatic loneliness of loss and grief. The other kind, the quiet, procedural loneliness of a person who has so thoroughly accommodated himself to absence that he cannot fully register presence when it occurs, who has so precisely calibrated his existence to the space his own smallness permits that he cannot expand into a larger space when offered one. The loneliness of a man who walks into every room knowing already that he is the background. I tried, once. I am recording this because it belongs in the record. I was 28 years old, and a woman in the residential corridor began talking to me about a moisture problem in her hab unit's lower wall, and she had a quality of attention that was different from most people's attention, a genuine orientation toward whatever she was looking at. And for a period of approximately 4 months, I found myself lingering near her corridor on unrelated pretexts. And I noted in my journal that my resting pulse during these encounters was elevated, approximately 7 beats per minute above baseline. And I understood this to be significant in a way I found difficult to process. We ate twice in the communal refectory. I attended a maintenance briefing that she also attended for reasons unrelated to our work. One evening, she asked me, with that genuine orientation of attention, what I was like, what I wanted, what the thing was that I would do if I could do anything. I did not have an answer. I had data, I had journals, I had temperature readings and humidity variances, and a carefully maintained log of junction performance across 23 years of service. But the question she was asking was about a self that had a wanting, a self that contained something beyond its function and its record. And I searched for that self in the space behind my sternum where I had understood it to reside, and I found the cavity, and I found the cavity. And I said something carefully precise about my work, about the importance of the maintenance function, about the satisfaction of systems operating within acceptable variance. She listened with that genuine attention, then she said something kind and moved on. I noted the exchange in my journal that evening. I noted the quality of her attention. I noted that my pulse returned to baseline within approximately 4 minutes of the conversation ending. I did know. T lingered near her corridor again. Some things, once examined accurately, do not benefit from further examination. I am standing at the observation port. The ships are moving now. Slowly, with the unhurried purpose of things that know exactly where they are going. They will collect what they came for, and they will depart, and the orbit around Aetheris Secundus will be empty again, and the census will close, and the celebrations will conclude, and the corridor outside the family's hab unit will return to its normal function as a transit space through which ordinary people move between their ordinary destinations. And I will walk those corridors as I have walked them for 23 years, maintaining the systems, recording the data, holding the structure together. I will be useful, I will be careful, I will be precise. I am going to tell you the answer to the question now. The question I have been asking since dawn, since the ships appeared in the upper atmosphere, since the ritual began again, and I stood in the corridor watching warm light come through an open door, and recognizing in that light everything I have spent 42 years walking away from. What do you call a man who was never wanted enough to be taken? You call him what he is, the one who stayed, not the one who was saved. Not the one who was fortunate, not the foundation, not the substrate, not the wall. Simply the one who stayed because there was nowhere to be taken to, because no one looked at him and found the thing the gray-robed men were looking for, because he was in the final accounting, ordinary in a way that the Imperium does not require candles for. The one who stayed because staying was the only thing left after the taking concluded, and who then spent 42 years becoming staying, inhabiting it so completely that the staying became indistinguishable from never having been anything else. I want to be precise about that. Tragedy requires stakes, and stakes require significance, and significance is precisely what was withheld. This is something smaller and more persistent than tragedy. This is erosion. The long, patient wearing away of a thing that no one valued enough to protect from the elements. The thing was there. It was always there. In the rounded, imprecise handwriting of a 5-year-old recording candles, in the 8 seconds and 11 beats per minute above baseline, when a child's laughter sounded like his sister's voice. In the 4 months of elevated pulse in a corridor near a woman with genuine attention. The thing was there, and then it was less there, and then it was so nearly not there that the space it occupied was smaller than the clinical notation required to record its departure. I am going to walk back to my hab unit now. I am going to sit at my small desk and open volume 61, and I am going to write this down, all of it, with the precision it deserves. Not because anyone will read it, not because the record will change anything about the shape of the years already lived, but because the recording is what I know how to do, and because this truth deserves to be recorded accurately, and because there is a 5-year-old in my memory drawing imprecise candles with a heavy pen, and he deserves, at minimum, to have someone tell him the truth about what those candles were. They were not for him. They were never for him. He was the frame around the empty space where something significant had been, and then was not. And the frame is a real thing. And frames have function, but no one brings a tablecloth for the frame. No one lights 12 candles in a circle for the thing that remains when the important thing is gone. I walked away from the celebration 4 units down. I walked past my childhood door. I walked to the obsticks, Irvidation port, and pressed my forehead to the cold glass, and watched the ships move in their slow, deliberate orbit. And I understood that the ships are not cruel. They are simply precise. They take what they came for, and they leave what they did not need. And what they leave behind is not wreckage. It is remainder. The mathematical remainder. The number left when you perform the subtraction. I am the remainder. I have always been the remainder. And the remainder goes on. That is the nature of a remainder. It persists. It continues. It occupies its exact and appropriate fraction of the total. It does not mourn being a remainder, because mourning requires the belief that one was supposed to be something else, and belief of that kind requires a kind of faith I burned through somewhere in the quiet years. Burned through so slowly that I did not notice the fuel was gone until the flame had already become a very small, very steady, very cold light. The ships will be gone by next week. The census will close. The celebrations will end. The children who were chosen will be collected by the gray-robed men and escorted to the ships, and the ships will take them wherever ships like those take the ones they carry, and their families will fold up the tablecloths and return them to neighbors, and the candles will gutter out one by one, and the rooms will go dark in stages. And then the ordinary will resume, the long, patient, necessary, uncelebrated work of being the substrate, of maintaining the systems, of holding the structure together for the significant things to move through. I will be here. I am very good at being here. I have had 42 years of practice, and I have the journals to prove it. 61 volumes of the most precise and detailed record of a man becoming gradually invisible that has ever been compiled in the lower residential corridors of Hive Aetheris. It is a thick, Uru record. It is accurate. It documents, with the rigor I have always brought to my work, the complete process by which a person can be subtracted from themselves, 1 degree at a time, so slowly that neither the person nor anyone observing him can identify the moment when the subtraction became critical, when the thing being removed crossed from non-essential to essential, When the removal stopped being careful, editing, and started being simply loss. I know when it started. It started with the smell of extinguished candles in the dark, and a bunk above mine with a body-shaped impression that no longer held a body, and the unasked question of a 5-year-old who understood that something had been subtracted and was not certain yet that the something was not him. It started there, and it went slowly, and I went with it, and here I am, and the ships are in orbit, and the question has finally been asked and answered, and the answer is what it is, and the remainder goes on. I have been sitting at my desk for an hour now. Volume 61 is open in front of me. I wrote the date at the top of the page in my usual hand, and then I wrote the time, and then I wrote the temperature reading from the small environmental gauge I keep mounted on the wall above the desk, a habit so ingrained I perform it before I perform any other act of recording. The external data first, always the external data first, as though the world must be anchored to its measurable facts before the interior can be approached with any confidence. 21 degrees, 43% humidity, the ventilation cycling at its standard evening pressure. These things are true. They can be confirmed by any instrument capable of measuring them. They are, in the vocabulary of my entire adult life, reliable. Everything else I am trying to write down is less reliable, not because it is inaccurate. I believe it is the most accurate thing I have ever attempted to record. It is less reliable in the sense that I cannot confirm it with external instruments, cannot cross-reference it against a baseline, cannot produce a second reading to verify the first. It is the record of an interior, and interiors are inherently harder to measure than corridors, and I have spent 42 years preferring corridors for exactly this reason. Let me try to be more precise about the shape of the damage, because I think the shape matters. I think the specific geometry of what happened to me matters in a way I have not previously been willing to engage with, because engaging with it meant accepting that something happened, that the years were not simply neutral and procedural, that the baseline I have been comparing myself to was itself the symptom rather than the standard. When I note no deviation from baseline, what I have always failed to ask is, what established the baseline? If the baseline was established in the immediate aftermath of loss, in the months and years following the extinguishing of the candles, then any measurement against it is a measurement against grief that was never processed, against absence that was never named. The instrument calibrated to 0 in the aftermath of subtraction will always read 0. That is not evidence of stability. It is evidence of a calibration error that has persisted for 4 decades. I am 47 years old and I have been calibrated wrong since I was 5, and every careful, precise, reliable measurement I have taken of myself has been wrong in exactly this way, has been wrong in exactly this way, has been measuring against a false 0, has been producing data that appeared clean and usable and indicated no deviation when the correct interpretation was that the deviation had become the default, that the atypical had been accepted as typical so thoroughly that the original typical had been lost without anyone filing a report. I want to talk about Vorik, my supervisor, my teacher, the man who trained my hands for this work. He has been dead for 6 years. He died of a pulmonary failure that I noted in my journal on the day it occurred, along with the fact that I attended his memorial service and that the service lasted 41 minutes and that the temperature in the small room where it was held was slightly above comfortable due to the number of people present. I noted that several of his other apprentices wept. I noted that I did not. I noted that I considered whether the weeping of others was something I should attempt to replicate as a social courtesy, and decided against it on the grounds that I did not feel I could do it convincingly, and that a false display seemed worse than an honest absence. I have reread this entry several times in the years since. Each time, I find it more disturbing than the time before, not because the reasoning is wrong. The reasoning is not wrong. It is the reasoning of a careful, precise, honest person who understood that weeping was expected and chose honest absence over dishonest performance. But there is something underneath the reasoning that I have only now, in this final accounting, been able to name. Vorik taught me everything I know about the deep systems. He spent 8 years patient with my questions and my errors and my particular kind of careful, meticulous, slightly anxious diligence. And at the end of those 8 years, he told my supervisor that I was the best apprentice he had trained in 30 years of training apprentices. And this was reported to me, and I noted it in my journal, and I noted that my pulse was elevated upon hearing it, and I noted that the elevation was 7 beats per minute and lasted approximately 12 seconds before returning to baseline. 12 seconds, 11 beats on the yacht. Her occasion, 8 seconds, and 12 seconds here. These are the 2 longest sustained emotional responses I have on record for the entire span of my adult life. A child laughing like my sister. A good man telling someone I was the best he had trained. 12 seconds each. And then the return to baseline. When Vorik died, I did not weep because I was not capable of it, not because I was unaffected. I want to be precise about the distinction, because I have been imprecise about it for too long, and the imprecision has done damage. I was affected. I am certain of this now, in a way I was not certain of it then. The fact that I did not deviate from baseline does not mean there was nothing to deviate from. It means the capacity to deviate had been so thoroughly eroded by that point that even a legitimate, appropriate, proportionate emotional response could not produce a measurable change in my internal readings. I was not unfeeling. I had become, through 40 years of careful suppression and precise notation and the gradual narrowing of the space I permitted myself to occupy, incapable of translating feeling into expression, incapable of allowing the interior to become visible on the exterior, incapable of being witnessed in the act of being affected by the world. That is different from not being affected. That is a crucially different thing. And I am 47 years old. And I am recording it for the first time. And I am aware that recording it now, in a journal that no one will read, in a hab unit sized for one person, in a corridor that knows me only as the maintenance technician who keeps its systems operational, does nothing to repair what it names. But the naming itself feels necessary. The naming feels like the first honest data point I have produced in decades, not a measurement of the absence. A measurement of the thing the absence replaced. There is a grief had. Air. I am going to let myself say that. There is a grief here that is 42 years old and has never been given appropriate expression and has consequently become structural. The way moisture that is never properly expelled becomes part of the wall it inhabits, changes the composition of the material, makes it heavier and more fragile at once. The grief is for Mavra, who I barely knew and who I never said goodbye to, because children are not told in advance when they are going to be taken. It is for my mother, who performed the correct celebration with the correct face, while her eyes held something I understood, even at 5, as a managed loss, a grief being carefully directed into the appropriately dutiful channels. It is for my father, who gripped my arm at the celebration with a tightness that was probably the excess of a feeling he could not otherwise express, and who spent the years after becoming quieter and smaller in the way that people do when something large has been removed from them, and who died at 63 of a cardiac event that I now wonder was in some part a physical expression of a grief he also never adequately processed. It is for Vorik, who was patient with me for 8 years, and who deserved 12 seconds more than I gave him. It is for the woman in the corridor with genuine attention in her eyes, who asked what I wanted and received an answer about system maintenance and nodded kindly and moved on, correctly interpreting the answer as the answer. It is for the boy with the heavy pen and the imprecise candles. Most of all, it is for him. He sat in the small chair at the edge of the celebration and ate his portion of the real meat carefully, slowly, in the manner of a person who understands that some things need to be remembered. He was 5 years old, and he was trying very hard to record everything accurately, to hold the details of the evening, in his memory with sufficient precision that he could return to them later and understand what they meant. He did not understand yet that the thing he most needed to record was not the candles or the tablecloth or his sister's stillness at the center of the light. The thing he most needed to record was himself, the boy who was eating carefully and watching everything and waiting to understand and feeling at the very bottom of the night, Below the careful observation and the precise attention and the practiced smile he produced when his father lifted him onto his shoulders, a simple animal terror of being left. Not left by Mavra specifically. Left by the quality of being worth returning for. Left behind in the permanent, definitive way that celebrations imply. Here is the thing that matters, and here is the proof that you are not it. He did not record that. He drew the candles instead, with their imprecise teardrops of flame, arranged correctly in their circle, everything in its proper position. He drew the external. He missed the internal, because he was 5 years old and had not yet developed the vocabulary. And then he spent the next 42 years developing a vocabulary specifically designed to avoid it. I pulled out Volume 1 this evening, after I came back from the observation port. I have not read Volume 1 in years. The handwriting is very small and careful for a child's handwriting. The letters formed with the deliberate attention of someone who was told to be neat and took the instruction seriously. The early entries are what I remember. External observations, careful and thorough. The temperature of the corridor at different times of day, the sounds of the neighbors through the wall, a catalog of the types of ration dispensed in the communal area across 7 consecutive days, presumably because I found the variation interesting, presumably because variation was something I paid attention to even then. And then, buried in the middle of the volume, between a record of the Hive Priest's weekly address and a detailed description of the sound the ventilation made during a maintenance cycle, an entry so short I nearly missed it. It is 11 words. I read them 4 times before I was certain I was reading them correctly. I think I was supposed to be somewhere else. I don't know where. 11 words. I was 7 years old, approximately, based on the entries surrounding it. I was 7 years old, and I wrote 11 words, and then I wrote the temperature of the corridor at the next maintenance cycle, and I continued. I continued for 40 more volumes and 40 more years, and the 11 words stayed on the page, and I never went back to them, because I had, by age 7, already begun to develop the habit of noting the uncomfortable thing precisely, and then moving past it with the speed of a person who understands that lingering is dangerous. I think I was supposed to be somewhere else. I did not know, at 7, where the somewhere else was. I do not know now, at 47, where it would have been. That is not the point. The point is the feeling itself, the intuition of a child that the world had a different shape intended for him, that some version of events contained a Kallin who was somewhere other than the small chair at the edge of the celebration, other than the corridor of sub-level 9, other than this hab unit precisely the right size for a person who has spent 42 years ensuring he takes up no more space than his function requires. The point is that the feeling existed. At 7 years old, it existed. And then it was noted and set aside. And the corridor temperature was recorded and life proceeded. I am going to go back to the observation port one more time before I sleep. I want to look at the ships again. In the dark of the night cycle, when the upper atmosphere holds them against a field of stars and the glass fogs slightly with my breath and the cold comes through to my forehead. I want to look at them, and I want to try to do the thing I have been unable to do for 42 years, which is to feel something all the way through without measuring it, without notation, without the calibrated instrument that steps between the event and its reception and produces a reading instead of an experience. I want to look at the ships that carried my sister away and feel whatever there is to feel about that, without management, without precision, without the careful organization of the interior into legible data. I do not know if I am capable of it. I have been doing the other thing for so long that the machinery of it is very deeply embedded. The reflexive reach for the notebook, the automatic measurement of the pulse, the habit of translation, event into observation, feeling into notation, life into record. It may be too late to override. The calibration error may have become structural, may have worked its way into the material the way 42 years of anything works its way into a person, changing the composition, making the original configuration irrecoverable. But I am going to try. This seems important, that I try. Not because trying will succeed, not because I expect a transformation, at the observation port on sub-level 9 in the middle of the night cycle, not because the ships will see me standing there with my forehead against the glass and offer some retroactive acknowledgement that I was worth considering. The ships are not interested in me. They were not interested in me at 5, and they are not interested in me now. And this is finally something I can hold in my hands and examine without flinching. The absolute, impersonal, complete indifference of the machinery that shaped my life. It was never about me. It was about what they were looking for. I simply did not contain it. And a child who does not contain a thing that enormous instruments are calibrated to detect cannot reasonably be held responsible for the absence. I could not have been different. I want to record this slowly, because it is the first thing in 42 years that feels like something I might eventually accept. I could not have been different. The gray-robed men looked at both children in that HAB unit on the second month of the census season, and they found in one of them a thing they were looking for and in the other an absence of that thing. And neither of these outcomes was available to choice, was available to effort, was available to the level of care and precision with which I have approached every other problem I have ever been assigned. You cannot maintain your way to being chosen. You cannot record your way to significance. You cannot make the ships take you by keeping accurate journals. You can only be what you are. And what I am was determined in some configuration of genetics, or fate, or the Emperor's inscrutable calculus that preceded my ability to influence it. And I have spent 42 years failing myself for a result I could not have altered. This is not peace. I want to be clear. This is not peace. What I am arriving at. Peace implies resolution, implies the wound closing into something clean and healed. What this is truth. And truth is a different thing from peace, is sometimes the opposite of peace, is sometimes the opposite of peace, is often the kind of clarity that makes comfort impossible because it removes the comfortable lie and leaves only the accurate picture, and the accurate picture of my life is neither comfortable nor resolved, but it is accurate. And I have always believed that accuracy is its own form of integrity. The ships will leave, within the week, probably. They will move out of the upper atmosphere with their cargo of chosen children, the ones the instruments found, the ones worth the tablecloths and the candles. And the orbit will be empty again, and the hive will settle back into its long, continuous, unremarkable function. The census will be a story people tell for a few weeks and then stop telling. The family 4 doors down will fold into the shape of their new life. The smaller shape, the way my parents folded into theirs, learning to live in the negative space where a child was and is no longer. They will be fine. People are fine. The Imperium has been taking children since before anyone in this hive was born. And the people left behind learn to be fine. Learn to be fine, because the alternative to fine is something the Imperium does not have resources to accommodate. I will be fine. I have always been fine. Fine is my area of expertise, my primary competency, the thing I do with more consistent skill than anything else. I will walk my corridors and maintain my systems and record my data and be reliably, precisely, carefully fine, and no one will know what happened at the observation port tonight, what was examined and what conclusion was reached, what 42 years of careful notation finally produced when forced to account for itself in honest terms. No one will know, because no one is in the habit of asking, and I am not in the habit of offering. And this has worked out well for the maintenance of the mutual fiction that I am simply a quiet man who prefers solitude, rather than a man who was so thoroughly emptied of the expectation of being known that the emptiness became indistinguishable from preference. But I will know. I will know in the way that accurate data is known, not comfortably, not with any warmth, but with the cold, permanent, irrefutable quality of a fact that has been verified and cannot be unverified. I was the child left behind. For 42 years I called that survival. Today, watching the black ships return to our orbit, I understand it was something else. What do you call a man who has never wanted enough to be taken? You call him what remains when you perform the subtraction. You call him the number left over. You call him the remainder. And the remainder goes on. It goes on because that is what remainders do. It goes on in the deep corridors of a hive that does not know its name. It goes on in a maintenance coverall worn smooth at the knees and elbows by 23 years of kneeling and reaching. It goes on in a plastic crate containing 61 journals, the first with a drawing of 12 imprecise candles arranged in a circle, a boo, the last with 11 words buried in the middle that were never followed by an answer. I think I was supposed to be somewhere else. I don't know where. The remainder goes on. It tucks that sentence back into the page. It closes the journal. It dresses for the morning shift. It walks out into the corridor that smells of recycled air and ration steam and the faint pervasive trace of moisture that always means a seal is beginning to fail somewhere nearby. It finds the failing seal. It repairs it with careful, practiced hands. It records the repair in the log. It moves on to the next junction and the next and the next because the systems require maintenance and it is good at maintenance. And this is the function it was left to perform. And above, in the orbit that will be empty again by next week, the ships carry their cargo of chosen children to whatever the Emperor requires of them. And in the corridor of sub-level 9, the ordinary man holds the structure together. And no one lights candles for the ones who stay. And the ones who stay do not ask for candles, because they learned very early that asking is a thing you do only when you believe an answer is possible, and they stopped believing that a long time ago, in the dark, in the smell of extinguished wax, looking at the impression in a mattress that was slowly recovering its neutral shape. That is all. That is the complete record. The data is as accurate as I am capable of making it, and my accuracy has been the most consistent thing about me, and so I trust it. The record stands. The remainder continues. The temperature in junction 77 alpha is within acceptable variance. Nothing further to note.